Hi there, and welcome to this quick three-part video series designed to help you get started designing and rendering picture-perfect perforated imagery in your architectural design projects. The goal here today will be to help you create imagery that is realistic in scale and patterning to how the panels will actually be manufactured in real life, so you can be confident that what you produce on paper looks as good in real life as possible. Many times we'll see architects here at Amico that come to us and they'll start with Photoshop to try to create images that are kind of like the picture perfect process. And the struggle is that the imagery isn't produced in such a way that matches how the manufacturing process works. So there's a gap in between design and reality. The other struggle we see some architects have is that they will try to get into Rhino and Grasshopper, which is a great solution and can produce some good results. However, if you've worked with Grasshopper at all, it's extremely difficult to learn, very slow, and there's a decent investment in terms of buying the software to begin with. So today's goal is to help you do something that is very quick and easy. We're going to be using a program called Paragraphic. It is very inexpensive, only $29, and it's an extremely simple, stripped down program that has all the necessary tools and mechanisms to help us create PNG files that you can import into your renderings that are very close to reality and how the manufacturing process will ultimately work. So as we jump in to kind of talk about what kind of imagery you're going to want to look for and how you're going to start to manipulate that imagery, this project here with Cab Calloway, one thing you'll start to notice as you think about this, you'll want to start to think about the tones between and contrast between different parts of the image and what your objectives are in terms of what you want to see. So you'll notice here that Cab Calloway's, the tone of his skin is somewhat close to the tone of the background. So as it gets converted into that whole the whole pattern, you'll see that the background kind of blends into his face a little bit, which may not be desirable. So you'll want to kind of get into Photoshop with your imagery to start to play with contrast to make sure things are reading the way you want. The other thing you might see here is his hair is all very dark and black in the original image, and not a lot of middle tones. As that gets translated into metal, the black that you see here is kind of the metal, the positive side of the image that you're seeing, and then the highlights and the midtones are the holes that are getting progressively larger. So in this case here, the image doesn't look terrible with his hair without a lot of that detail shining through. But if you have certain imagery where you want to see more detail, those mid-tones are going to become a lot more important. You can kind of see that here in this image here with this car that is very dark. So first, with this project, we eliminated the background just to kind of remove distractions of the eye to make sure that everybody could see the car primarily and first. And then also you'll see here with this car, there's a broad range of midtones that get translated very nicely. So you appreciate those highlights, but you also kind of see the progressions to other elements of the car image. Lastly, here in this first part of the video, that we need to start to talk about that will help you understand the decisions we're making in part two is around how these panels ultimately get manufactured. The first thing to think about is the grid size. You'll see here there's two typical ways of working with the grid. The first is a 1x1 grid, so all the holes are spaced 1 inch on center apart, or a ½ inch on center apart. The benefit of working on a 1 inch grid is that it's going to be less expensive. There's fewer holes that have to get punched, and so it's more cost effective. The trade-off, though, when you go with that large grid, of course, is that resolution's a little bit bigger, which in many cases it doesn't matter. If you have a very large image that's 1 or 2 stories in the air, you're not going to really notice the difference between a 1 inch grid and a ½ inch grid. But if the imagery is much more detailed, or you're working in a smaller space, or the viewer is going to be much closer to the imagery, working on a ½ inch grid may become much more important. The other thing to note here is the hole size. If you're working on a 1 inch grid, your holes are going to vary from an 1/8 inch to a 0.875 size of holes and all the increments in between. But on a ½ inch grid, those hole sizes will not get as big, so they'll remain smaller. The other thing to note here, the reason we're starting at 0.125, in most cases, we're working with an eighth inch thick of aluminum. And typically the rule of thumb is that putting a very small hole in a thick piece of metal is very difficult. So you want to start with a hole diameter that is equal to or bigger than the thickness of the metal. So an eighth inch thick piece of aluminum will will have the smallest hole size be 0.125. In part two here, we'll be looking at using the tool paragraphic, understanding the different buttons you'll need to learn and work through to be able to create the picture perfect images. And then in part three, we'll talk about inverting the image and backlighting it and selecting colors to make sure you preserve the contrast and all the things that you need to consider.